During the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was swept by a brutal tide of persecution as a troubled society set out to purge itself of an imagined evil. Thousands of innocent people were to suffer and die. The echo of their pain still resounds. The dark shadow of those who drove them to their deaths falls over stricken towns and villages. Some places have witnessed past tragedies so powerful that the very earth vibrates with the emotions of those events. Sometimes, these painful echoes reach out across time to bring us face to face with our haunted history. Mistley, a remote Essex village on England's east coast, bears the mental scars of the tragic events in its past. The village pond is a popular beauty spot, but few local people would venture there after dark. On the evening of the 29th of May 1994, a visiting fisherman, Richard Mays, unaware of Mistley Pond's sinister reputation, settled down by the water's edge. He was looking forward to a pleasant night's fishing. Richard Mays had every reason to be alarmed. The ghost he saw was once the most feared man in eastern England, a man whose single-minded quest had sent hundreds of innocent people to the gallows. Matthew Hopkins, remembered to posterity by his common title, the Witchfinder General. The flatlands of East Anglia, to the north of London. Here, more than 300 years ago, when England was split apart by civil war, Hopkins conducted a fanatical witch-hunting campaign that cast a shadow of fear and suspicion across every village and town. Reason and sense were victims of powerful superstition. Communities fractured and families disintegrated. Frightened people betrayed their friends, their neighbours, and even their own children. Although the witch craze had been raging across mainland Europe since the 16th century, before the 1640s, the craze had barely touched England. An ambitious and determined young lawyer was to change all that. The upheavals of the English Civil War brought him to the Essex village of Manningtree. He developed a macabre interest in witchcraft that set him on his unholy quest. Fascinated, Matthew Hopkins read whatever he could find upon his subject, studying the standard witchcraft texts of the day. His handbook was a manual for the detection, torture, trial, and execution of the devil's secret agents, the witches. A door opened into the dark world of pain, betrayal, and death. From his books, Hopkins learned how, all across Europe, suspected witches had been broken down by brutal torture. The suffering only stopped with a confession and the names of other witches. Each new confession confirmed the interrogator's belief that the witch threat was real, and each confessed witch provided new suspects. There were few who dared question the logic of this process. As he studied these accounts, Hopkins saw his future unfolding before him.
Matthew Hopkins is the classic example of the self-taught man. He buys what he can find, and then he reads it and believes the lot. Hopkins diverts his energy into witch hunting as a deeply held belief intended for the good of his people and the salvation of his soul, as well as his land. He becomes an expert in it.
In the 17th century, the devil was thought of as a tangible being, and witches as people who helped him with his evil schemes. The most humble country folk had seen images of Satan, and could picture the witches who used his evil powers in their own malicious plans.
Hopkins was obsessed with the devil. One could suggest he's also obsessed with sex with the devil, because if there's one stereotyped component, it's A, about doing a deal with the devil, and B, about having intercourse with him. Hopkins does seem fascinated by this.
Witches could be of either sex, but suspects were almost always women. Women at that time had few claims to property. Widowed and unmarried women were especially vulnerable in times of crisis and poverty. Women like these, it was often thought, could well be resentful and easily tempted to vengeance. Alone and unloved, such women might yield to the devil's fatal advances.
There's a very strong belief in this period that women are the more lustful of the two sexes. So for a theologian or for a Dominican inquisitor, it's very easy for them to see why witches would be seduced by the devil, because they're stupid and because they are quite happy to jump into bed with anybody who accosts them. So at an elite level, it makes perfect sense to see why women would be seduced very easily by the devil. At a popular level, it's far more to do with what women are capable of. Women are capable of creating life. They're the ones who give birth. This life-giving power that women have can be very dangerous. So the witch, in popular belief, is the inverse of all those positive female qualities. It's women who harm, it's women who poison, it's women who damage.
In the popular imagination, witches, tainted by the devil's evil, were blamed for illness, storms, the death of livestock, and the failure of crops. Witches could fly. They could alter their form. They could even be in two places at once. They used magic to bewitch and confuse, so it wasn't easy to know who they were. It didn't take long for village gossip to become accusation, as people looked around them for likely suspects. Faced with this evil hidden in their midst, insecurity grew into paranoia as witch hunting spread across mainland Europe. In this imagined struggle between God and the devil, Europe entered a new age of terror in which thousands of innocent people were to die. In 1647, at the height of the witch craze, the Archbishop in Trier, Germany, organized a fanatical purge of the surrounding countryside. It was to be the most extreme witch hunt in Europe's history. At its end, 2 villages were left with only 1 living female. Anyone who spoke out against the carnage found themselves next for the fire. In all, 40,000 people perished. But while the witch craze raged in Europe, in England, a more moderate attitude had prevailed.
In Europe, witches were burnt because witchcraft was a heresy, whereas in England, witches were hanged because witchcraft was a felony. The methods of proving witchcraft were also different. In Europe, torture was an accepted, an integral part of the legal system, whereas in England, subjects in witchcraft cases could not be tortured according to the law.
To stay within the letter of the English law, Hopkins began to think of more insidious forms of coercion, ones that would break his victim's silence, yet would leave no physical signs. Hopkins experimented. binding his victims tightly on wooden racks and depriving them of food and sleep, he could make them confess to anything he suggested. Hopkins was so eager to get on with his crusade, he took shortcuts. People believed that witches used diabolical animals, or familiars, as helpers in their work. Presence of such creatures was considered evidence of a witch's guilt. So, if familiars were to appear conveniently during an interrogation conducted by Hopkins, it would speed judgment. The scheme worked even better than could have been hoped. In 1645, Hopkins bound a suspected witch to a rack, kept her awake, and waited. On the fourth night, according to Hopkins, the familiars appeared in the interrogation cell. A cat, a dog, and a rabbit. The woman, hallucinating from lack of sleep and food, and now almost entirely out of her mind, immediately confessed to being a member of a coven of witches. She gave the names of 6 other women who had joined her in an evil pact. One was her own daughter. Armed with his ever-growing list of suspects, Hopkins set out to cleanse the whole county of Essex. Fear, panic, and opportunistic envy trailed in his wake.
Matthew Hopkins is a young man in a hurry. He's also an angry young man. And he gets an extraordinary opportunity. He's working at a time when civil war has destroyed the traditional religious and political authority system. And so a young zealot like him can come forward and look like a saviour figure. He tells people, I have a foolproof way of finding witches. I have methods which can make them confess their faults. Show me your witches. And what happens then is that local society purges itself. Grotesquely, 250 people at least are brought before him for interrogation. Over 100 are executed. It is the largest witch hunt in the whole of English history.
Like most of Hopkins' victims, Anne West was an ordinary housewife. Unknown to her, she'd already been named as a witch during an interrogation of an earlier victim. Now, Anne West was on Hopkins' list. For her, there could be no escape. Hopkins had only to decide how he would prove her guilt. He called in a midwife to search Anne West for the so-called marks of the devil. A third nipple was best. A strange wart, mole or pimple would suffice, especially if the mark behaved unusually when pricked. A mark was found on Anne West. She was locked up to await formal trial. In a cellar beneath the Thorn Inn in Mistley, Anne awaited her fate.
I have been found guilty of bringing harm to my neighbours and putting a spell upon 2 of their pigs, which I know I have had no part in. I only hope that the great God Almighty will guide the learned judge to see reason and justice, to uphold the law and pardon me of these crimes which I know nothing of.
In July 1645, Anne West was one of a group of women who stood trial in Chelmsford, Essex. It was to be the largest witch trial in English history.
Catherine Fairgood, Rebecca West, Anne Leach, Emily Whittle.
Hopkins had prepared his evidence carefully. The judge was inexperienced and was easily swayed by the confident witch hunter. The verdict would be one of Hopkins' greatest triumphs.
Sarah Bright and Anne West, you have been found guilty of causing harm to persons and their property. You will be taken from this court to a place of execution, where you will be hanged.
Anne West, along with 18 other women, was hanged at Seafield Bay outside Manningtree. But as a victim of one of the worst miscarriages of justice in English history, Anne West's spirit could not rest in peace. The Thorn Inn, where Anne West was held before her death, is now a popular pub. Michelle Peartree, a barmaid there, noticed that the inn had an unusual visitor.
One night, after a busy night, we'd closed up, we'd got rid of everybody, and we thought we'd sit down and have a quiet drink and relax. And I caught something at the corner of my eye, and I thought, what's that? And I turned round, and there was this lady, all dressed in grey. She just glided across the bar and just looking, and I looked. Young lady, about 25. I suppose I knew that it wasn't somebody we'd locked in the pub, because they don't wear dresses like that anymore. It was all very strange and a bit unnerving. Apparently she's one of the witches that Matthew Hopkins hung, and she has been seen by numerous people all over the pub.
Hopkins, by now calling himself the Witchfinder General, expanded his lucrative business across East Anglia. He travelled the countryside, advertising his services to the magistrates of every town. The money flowed in. Hopkins was expensive. His fee was sometimes more than an average yearly wage, but there was no shortage of clients. As Hopkins' progress continued, many villagers began to see the naming of witches as a convenient, if expensive, way of disposing of a rival or enemy. When malice and envy were unleashed, no one was safe. John Lowes, a stern and upright pastor from the Suffolk village of Branston, was disliked by his grumbling parishioners. They had failed to get rid of Lowes by orthodox methods. When they heard that Hopkins was in the area, they accused Lowes of witchcraft and invited Hopkins to their village to prove it. The frail old man was no match for the Witchfinder General. Lowes confessed. He was condemned and hanged. Soon, Hopkins was using another method of witch detection, an ancient ordeal known as swimming. The accused were tied up and thrown into water. If they surfaced, it proved that the devil was helping them, or that they were too evil for the water to accept them. Either way, if they didn't sink, they were witches. If they did sink, they were deemed innocent, but would have drowned anyway. It was a ludicrous and cruel logic, but to Hopkins, it had the virtue of simplicity and ease. Many of his victims drowned here at Mistley Pond.
It seems pretty well certain that every single one of Hopkins' victims perished as a scapegoat. They were always people who had made enemies in the community, sometimes the whole community, sometimes just a powerful faction who would shout down their few friends. The communities of East Anglia took an enormous emetic in Hopkins' witch hunt, and the result was virtually a holocaust of the unwanted, marginalised, suspected figures.
Having exhausted his home territories, Hopkins was forced to go further afield. In the spring of 1647, he arrived at the village of Great Staunton in Huntingdonshire. But here, his confident progress was abruptly halted. Reason still prevailed. The minister of the parish, John Gall, confronted Hopkins and his flawed argument. He appealed to the congregation to defend the weak and vulnerable against unjust and evil persecution.
Every old woman with a wrinkled face, a funny brow, a hairy lip, a gobbled tooth, a squint eye, a squeaky voice, or a scolding tongue, having a ragged coat on her back, a skull cap on her head, a spindle in her hand, and a dog or cat by her side, is not only suspected, but pronounced for a witch. Having taken the suspected...
John Gall is a country vicar, and he decides to strike out publicly against Hopkins and all his works. And therefore he deploys a whole range of arguments. And this is formidable stuff. It's going to be read by a lot of people. It's respected. Whether or not it ends Hopkins' witch hunt, one cannot say. One feels the Hopkins witch hunt ends when people have destroyed their local malefactors. In other words, when enough people have been hanged, there's no need to go on.
John Gall was a brave man. Many who had denounced witch hunting in the past had died regretting it. But Gall's stand was applauded by his parishioners and quickly taken up in the surrounding countryside. For now the tide was turning. People began to find the courage to speak out against the witchfinder. Hopkins was being turned away as the eastern counties awoke from their nightmare. Belief in this vast witchcraft conspiracy began to seem just what it was, a delusion. Embarrassment replaced zeal. The witchfinder became as unpopular as he once was welcome. Hopkins was justifying himself by writing his memoirs, but his name had already become a watchword for evil. Some say the tables were turned, and Hopkins was himself executed for sorcery. Others claim that he soon sickened and died. Matthew Hopkins, sometime Witchfinder General, was buried at Mistley Heath on the 12th of August 1647. He was just 27 years of age. Manningtree's ancient walls are still shadowed by the restless echoes of Hopkins' dark reign. His spirit disturbs the uneasy peace of a place that has long been trying to forget its past.